absolutely free.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of the day here on the show, like I mentioned before the break, we're going to be heading into our injury updates / fantasy implications segment, talking about some key injuries that occurred recently and how they might affect your team going forward in these coming weeks. And I feel like for the first time in quite some time, I'm not necessarily mentioning many new injuries here. Yes, there were a couple lingering ones that have occurred over the past couple of weeks, in weeks 9 through 10 specifically, but I'm going to be having a more positive bent with this one because of all potential injury returns we're going to have. Like I said, a lot of teams are coming back from the byes and thus allowing for more players to get healthy, like the one we're going to talk about at the start of this segment, but also just more optimistic outlooks over these past couple of weeks in terms of the health of certain players. We've seen a little bit of decline since, the middle of the season to now, where we're seeing a lot less injuries occur and more players return from them rather than head to the IR. Without further ado, let's talk a little bit about these injuries, but also update you on some ones that could be lingering or reoccurring. Let's start off with some of the returns, though. Let's start off with one of the most important ones for the Bucs here in Mike Evans. He broke his leg, obviously, a couple weeks back, but now he's looking like he's going to be returning to the Bucs after their bye week, and it's going to be for a very important stretch of their season because after this bye week, they may just have the toughest schedule in the NFL. We're just going to pull it up here to go over it because it is a gauntlet here. They do have some easy games right after their bye. The Giants, Panthers, and Raiders, all winnable games. They play the Chargers, Cowboys, and Panthers. So actually, they do have one of the more easy schedules, mind you. I was more concerned about the results beforehand, perhaps. The fact that they weren't able to win any of those big games against teams like the Ravens and the Chiefs. But in this easier schedule, expect the return of Mike Evans to potentially bolster this team because, for what it's worth, they were playing really physical, tough football without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin anyways. So I feel like their backs are up against it in the NFC South, but if, NFC North teams start to decline, the NFC West becomes more of a logjam, if Seattle's able to stick around these next couple of weeks, then, there's a chance for the Bucs to make a little bit of a run here and sneak into the playoffs as a wild card. And potentially, with how shaky the Falcons look, they might be able to win the NFC South despite not winning the head-to-head tiebreaker against them. So this is one of the more positive injury updates I can give you right now, and also in terms of fantasy implications, because I feel like, it might be to the detriment of people who bought into the Cade Otton, Jalen McMillan hype, but it also opens up, this avenue of, okay, the Bucs now know what they are without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, so potentially some of these players who got a lot more interest in them and a lot more targets this time around might continue to do so because only Mike Evans is coming back, right? Not Chris Godwin for the rest of the season. So guys like Cade Otton and Jalen McMillan and Bucky Irving will still be valuable, I believe, from a fantasy perspective. So that's a really positive sign that an upward trajectory is coming for the Bucs and for your fantasy team, perhaps. Now let's talk about Nico Collins, who could have been back a bit sooner than expected. It turned out to be a game-time decision in the game against the Lions, and boy, could they have needed them there. Because had they held on in that game, that's perhaps the most impressive win this season by any team, really. And I feel like, the decision to sit him out for that game was essentially a good one because they might want him for more of a stretch run here. They have the division wrapped up and they didn't want to risk, in a pretty physical game, Nico Collins re-aggravating that injury, so it was a smart move, but that win could have really bolstered the case for them to be a sneaky Super Bowl contender, Houston. I still regard them very highly in the AFC. They might just be the second or third best team in the AFC when all is said and done, but I think that in that game, you might have wanted a Nico Collins to push you over the edge. He could have been the difference in that one. But I feel like, they have the bye. They can nurse him back to health. And he's going to come back. And potentially, the Texans can go on a heater here. I'm not familiar with their schedule as much as I am with the Bucs in terms of easiness. But I'll be able to pull it up here and tell you more about it. After this short hiatus here, they're going to place the Cowboys, Titans, and Jags. So that's an easy schedule. The Dolphins, Chiefs, and Ravens remain, though, for them towards the end of the season. So that could be a tough gauntlet. And you're going to want Nico Collins to stay healthy for that stretch. So kind of sacrificing what could have been a pretty important game in terms of setting the bar in the AFC in terms of respectable wins for that stretch run at the end that includes divisional conference opponents, I feel like the Texans played it smart here. But, it would have been fun to see if he could have been the difference maker for the Texans in that one. But let's hope for a speedy recovery for him and hope that we see him on the field come this Sunday, helping the Texans achieve their goals for this season. Now let's get into a little bit more of the bad news on the injury front that everyone kind of saw coming. Dak Prescott. The season-ending surgery for him after that knee injury he suffered a couple weeks ago. And for what it's worth, I feel like it could have been a lot worse for the Cowboys in terms of, how the organization handled it. But they feel very candid about where this injury stands with them. A lot of positive news and signs coming out of Cowboys camp about Dak's recovery. And so I feel like if this were an injury where a lot of the news coming back to the average fan was very negative and Jerry Jones created more of a tense situation, intense culture after the season they've been having, then all bets will be off for this team. I think the rails would completely fall off and there would be no hope. But now there's optimism. I think that this team can play a little more loosely, especially because potentially Dak was part of the problem in terms of how him and CD had to perform at a high standard because of their ties to their contracts and what that meant for them. So I think this alleviates some of the burden now. I think that the Cowboys, as funny as it is to say, no matter who's at the helm for them at the quarterback position, Cooper Rush or Trey Lance, I feel like there's going to start to be a little bit more anxiety-free football coming from the Cowboys. And so it may not change much of the trajectory of their season, but it certainly is something to take away, a silver lining to hold on to for the Cowboys and their fans. But I hope that Dak recovers speedily and healthily and returns and is in better mindset than he perhaps was this season. Now let's talk a little bit more about the recent injury because there are several that could be concerning. So let's start off with perhaps the least concerning and then move up a little bit here. Dalton Kincaid, his knee injury during that game against the Colts was a little bit concerning. I believe he did return to play early in the third quarter. Kind of was in and out of the game. That's always something to monitor with a guy like Dalton Kincaid and tight ends in particular, as we're going to find out in this segment. I feel like these younger guys, especially in teams that value them a little bit more than others, might be more injury prone, but they still aren't so injury prone that they'll be out for extended periods of time to where you're going to have to worry in terms of finding contingency plans for them, if you know what I mean. Because I still personally have Dalton Kincaid in my fantasy squad, and whether he's been injured or not, I feel like, the overall balance of my squad can help compensate for injuries to my tight end. Because I'm not saying that the tight ends aren't important, but their volatility is always to be expected. And if you stay ahead of the curve and have faith and trust in your team outside of the position, then chances are you're fine in terms of contingency plans and how to account for them. But it is interesting to see all these younger tight ends especially get injured so often. Which brings me to Sam Laporta's injury, which is more of a day-to-day situation. He could be questionable for this week against the Jags, but again, he's someone I wouldn't necessarily worry about too much like Kincaid, because A, the Lions' offense will be just fine without him, and B, it's not like he's going to miss too extended a period of time, and if you do have him on your fantasy team, chances are you have a pretty good fantasy team to compensate for his loss here. But it's interesting to monitor because of, the Lions' run going forward. They're not playing a lot of tough games, so potentially if this injury continues to aggravate him, they might hold him out for a longer period of time and use him for a bit more of a stretch run. But I do think that because of, his versatility in this offense, he won't be out for long, and he'll make a speedy return here for the Lions. And then, Trevor Lawrence's injury is a bizarre one because he is someone who I wouldn't necessarily want getting too banged up, right? Because the Jaguars are playing out the season here, not with any big stakes whatsoever. So, it wouldn't make any sense really to hurry Trevor Lawrence back. They are hoping for a post-bye return, I hear, from the Jags camp. But it's not like, it would be a kind of rejuvenation or reinvigoration to the Jags if he does come back, because they'll still be bad and there'll still be problems with that offense. So I'm not necessarily too concerned about Trevor Lawrence. You shouldn't really be either, because I don't necessarily think many of you have him on your roster, perhaps in a deeper league. So that injury is a little bit humdrum. And then Isaiah Pacheco as well, returning to practice, could be a positive sign for this Chiefs offense. But other than that, let me know what you think about the injury crisis. Coming up next, though, we'll be making some big picks in big games this week in the NFL. It should be very exciting. A lot of divisional rivalries, a lot of conference rivalries to talk about. So we'll be right back after this short break.